All right, good afternoon. Hope everyone is doing good. So let's go ahead and start for this week. Um, since I already shared the previous lecture with you on Sunday, so that applied for this work week. So we're pretty much sticking to the schedule, which means today we're going to go over chapter number 5, as we can see here. So just a few quick reminders. First up, your lecture exam is still active as we speak, and I deliver the lecture here. So hopefully you would all be able to finish and turn the work in by 9 p.m. As the deadline was mentioned before. And the lab work also has been shared for today, as well as tomorrow and Thursday. And as I'd mentioned previously, all of that would be graded all together on Sunday. So that's the pattern we're going to follow from now onwards. I think that's a bit easier on everyone involved here. So we're going to do that. Um, I will be updating your grades as far as your lecture exam number 1 is concerned for uh, everything after it's turned in tonight. So by tomorrow, midday, hopefully you should be able to see those grades. Um, Case studies, as I'd mentioned, I'm working on those guidelines too. As soon as I'm done, I'm going to send those out. Okay, so those were the reminders that I had for now. Uh, so let's go ahead and pick up our discussion here with chapter number 5, which is the study of histology. And as we mentioned before, histology is the study of tissues. Cytology was the study of cells, right? And tissues are what? Cells that are similarly shaped and similarly functioning uh, in the body are grouped together as tissues, okay? So these two sciences, cytology and histology, and to a great extent embryology as well, they basically really come to life under the microscope, right? Because you need that device to actually realize this microscopic world that we're surrounded by, not only our tissues, but what lives on us and within us. So literally billions of bacteria, even more viruses, fungi, protists, all kinds of microorganisms, and some which are not technically even organisms, again, like viruses and prions that we'll talk about later on. They inhabit our ecosystem, okay? And every now and then they make their presence felt, as was the case for the past year and a half. Coronavirus, it has entered everyone's collective consciousness now. And unfortunately, that by no means is the last of a virus that we have seen. So based on the current demographic patterns, the way the world population is growing, global travel is becoming more common, global warming because of, again, overpopulation, people burning fossil fuels, all of that, those gases going up in the atmosphere and warming up the planet. So more and more of the uh, polar regions are becoming more tropical, right? They're becoming warm and humid, which means that the microorganisms and vectors, whether they're mosquitoes or ticks or fleas or mites or those kinds of critters that are common vectors for these diseases, are finding their niche in these faraway places that was not possible before. So seems like in the next 10 to 20 years, there would be no such thing as tropical medicine. It's one of my favorite disciplines, as I'd mentioned, right? So what we now call tropical medicine will become global medicine, because everyone will be faced with those vectors and those so-called third world diseases that no one had heard of before. As we speak right now in Texas, there have been outbreaks of the West Nile virus. There have been outbreaks of Zika virus, dengue, yellow fever, chikungunya, and all of these viral diseases are transmitted uh, by mosquitoes, right? So it's happening. Fortunately, no malaria outbreaks. Malaria is slightly different because it's actually caused not by a virus, but a parasite called Plasmodium falciparum. And we'll talk about that later on as well. So let's uh, quickly take notes here. Taking your first lecture exam hopefully also gave you a good idea of what those exams are structured as and the importance of listening to lectures and notes and paying attention to those things, right? Tropical medicine, global overpopulation, uh, mosquito-borne illnesses in Texas. Um, um, One of my favorites. Okay, what else? And future pandemics, yes. Okay, all right, so let's take a look here. Histology. So basically, we are going to talk about 4 types of tissues. So remember, in humans, there are 4 primary types of tissues, okay? And though for some reason they're not showing up here, but those 4 types of tissues are epithelial, nervous, muscular, and connective. All right, so these 4 tissues. So every single cell out of the trillions of cells that make up or constitute a human body, each of those could be fitted in one of those 4 categories. All right, there is no 5th category of cells. So that's what we're going to look at. So let's start with the first type, as we see here, the epithelial cells. If you look at the term itself, epi means before, thelium is a covering. So an epithelium is an outside covering, which means your skin, as well as the outside coverings of your internal organs, like your digestive organs, respiratory organs, so on and so forth. So that's what we're looking at here. So they're, as we can see here, made up of 1 or more closely packed layers of cells with little to no extracellular matrix. What is a matrix? The surrounding tissue to the epithelium, okay? It's basically made up of extracellular fluid, cells, and connective tissue, okay? So that's what we are looking at. So what are some of the characteristics of epithelial tissue? Let's take a look at that here. Epithelial tissue is basically attached underneath to a basement membrane, right? So that's one thing to remember. Then epithelial tissues are also avascular. So which means they do not have their own blood supply. So the answer question is, then how do they survive? Well, they basically suck up the nutrients and diffuse in the nutrients and oxygen from the underlying connective tissue. They do not have a vascular supply of their own. Extensive innervation, they're sensitive. Anyone who, if you caress your skin, right? Or if you get a bite on there or something like that, and you know how sensitive our epithelium is. Same with your internal organs, right? So any process that causes your internal organs to dilate or become constricted causes intense pain. Anyone who suffered from pain of kidney stones or acute appendicitis or even childbirth would testify to that. So that's because of extensive innervation there. High regeneration capacity, which is a necessity, of course, because epithelial tissue is by definition being scraped away as, you know, every living moment of our lives. Like our skin, we scratch our skin, thousands of skin cells are lost and they're being regenerated and replenished. So this is a prime example of an epithelial tissue. Okay, what shape does it look like? They look like columns. So this is columnar epithelium, column shaped, right? There's a single layer of epithelial columnar cells, as you can see, a single nucleus in the middle. There's the basement membrane on which it lies, right? And beneath the basement membrane is this thick connective tissue from where they derive their nutrition and oxygen, okay? So this is called the apical surface, the apex, the top of the epithelial cells. The sides are called the lateral surface, okay? Lateral, of course, means the side. So therefore, that's what you're looking at here. So these are some of the functions of the epithelial tissue. Of course, physical protection, that goes without saying. Your skin and also the epithelial lining to your internal organs. Selective permeability. So pretty much like your cell membrane, the epithelial tissue is selective. It allows certain substances to pass across. It does not allow others to do so. Your epithelial tissue also secretes, like your digestive organs. They're secreting digestive enzymes. So that is coming from the epithelial tissue and sensations. So as we mentioned before, our epithelial tissue is quite sensitive. It has a very good sensory nerve supply. So how do you classify your epithelial tissue? Well, one way of doing that is to look at the number of layers of cells, all right? So you can have just a single layer of cells, that's called simple epithelium, or you can have multiple layers of cells, one on top of the other, and that is called stratified epithelium. Strata means layers. So it's a layered appearance that we're talking about here. So those areas of the body where you just need simple secretion, absorption, filtration, you have usually a simple epithelial layer, single layer. And those areas where you need to be wear and tear resistant, right? Or mechanical resistance is needed against friction and so on, you tend to find stratified epithelium there. Then you also have something called pseudostratified epithelium. So pseudo means false. So what is pseudostratified epithelium? Well, So this is again a simple epithelium. However, the cells are arranged at different heights, like the 5 fingers, right? All 5 fingers are different heights. One has a nucleus here, the other cell has a nucleus there, another one has a nucleus here. And so if you look at this picture, even though it's like just a single layer, but the length, the height of the cells is different, and the nuclei are located at different levels. So it gives you an illusion of being multi-layered, but it's not. So that's what your pseudostratified epithelium is, okay? All right, so in addition to those layers, you can also classify your epithelial tissue in terms of shape. So here are some shapes that we are looking at. And so let's take a look at this picture. Okay, there. So simple epithelium. So you can see that this is a single layer of cells, right? And you can see the nuclei. The nucleus is there, and they're lying on a basement membrane that you can see here as well. All right, what shape is this? So it's like compressed, like flat, almost like tiles on a floor. So this shape is called squamous epithelium. So you're looking at simple squamous epithelium here, the kind that you find in your lungs, in your alveoli. So remember, alveoli are those grape shaped clusters of grape-like structures that are involved with the absorption of gases like nitrogen, like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so that's where you'll see this type of an epithelium. Here's a stratified epithelium. Look at that. It has multiple layers of cells, one stacked on top of the other. So that's what stratified epithelium is like, right? If you look at the shape, well, these seem to be cuboidal shaped cells, like cubes, boxes, right? Cuboidal cells. These ones seem to be squamous shaped, and these seem to be like smooth muscle cells, right? So what would those be? Semi-squamous shape is what I'm seeing here. So basically, how would I classify this entire epithelium? Transitional, which is a very special type of epithelium. Almost, it's exclusively found in your urinary tract, in your urinary bladder, ureters, urethra, okay? Because it can change its shape from different, among different types, like the box-like cuboidal cells, and then these squamous cells at the top. So here you can look at those shapes as well, all right? So shape and layers. And here, this is a helpful table. It classifies the types of epithelium in those two types, and then what they are, all right? So let's look at each type in turn and see where in the body are they found. So for example, simple squamous epithelium, all right? Very simple, literally. It's like this compressed tile-like cells. As I mentioned, these are perfect for absorption and secretion, and they're found in abundance in your respiratory tract, in your alveoli, as you can see here. They line the air sacs of the lungs, the alveoli, also the walls of your vessels, and the serous fluid secreting membranes, the mesothelium. That is where you find them. Simple cuboidal epithelium. So look at the shape again, cube shaped, therefore the name, right? They again are involved with secretion and absorption. And one place where you'll find them in abundance is in your kidneys, because kidneys are organs of secretion and absorption, as you can see here, okay? So kidney tubules, thyroid gland follicles, also the ovary. So what does the ovary secrete? The egg, of course, the oocyte, and also estrogen, the female sex hormone. Simple columnar epithelium, okay, so column-shaped cells, a single layer, and they come in two types, the ones with hair-like cilia and the ones which are non-ciliated, two types. So let's take a look at the first type, which is non-ciliated simple columnar epithelium. So no cilia, no hair-like structures here. However, you have these little finger-like structures called the villi, okay? So you see them here, finger-like structures called villi or microvilli, as you can see. And this type is found throughout your GI tract, your gastrointestinal tract, your digestive system. And this type of epithelium is perfect, again, for secretion and absorption. So lots of digestive juices are secreted in your intestines, and you basically absorb nutrients across. So that's where you find them. So location, as you can see here, most of your digestive tract. All right, so ciliated simple columnar epithelium. Now here you can appreciate the cilia. If you look at this picture, look at the top, how you have these tiny hair-like cilia. So where do you find ciliated simple columnar epithelium? Again, in your respiratory tract, in the lining of the larger bronchioles, as you can see. Also in the female fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes, okay? So what do these cilia do? These cilia in the respiratory tract, hair-like structures, they trap dust and debris and smoke that you might breathe in, okay? And therefore, chronic smokers, people who smoke for long periods of time, they often develop something called the smoker's cough, okay? And we all know what that smoker's cough sounds like. It's very wet, productive, like a paroxysmal attacks of cough kind of thing, right? And why is that? Because the cigarette smoke basically destroys the cilia. Okay, so the cigarette smoke has no less than 300 known carcinogens, cancer-causing chemicals. But possibly the three most harmful ones are nicotine, carbon monoxide, and tar. Okay, so we're talking about the cilia, right? So let me take notes here. Right, so nicotine is this drug, this adrenaline agonist that causes your blood pressure to shoot up, your heart to beat faster, something called tachycardia, puts you at risk for hypertension, high blood pressure, strokes, heart attacks, all kinds of things. It's also addictive, highly addictive, and that's why people get addicted to tobacco, nicotine. Carbon monoxide is a poisonous gas. Carbon monoxide has 120 times more affinity for your hemoglobin on your red blood cells than oxygen. So if you're taking in carbon dioxide into your system, it's going to kick out oxygen, no problems there, and basically slowly poison you. Finally, tar is this thick, gooey, charcoal-like substance, right? Which again is a uh, residual remnant of the cigarette smoke. If you use a filter on your smoking device, then it minimizes these things, but still it's there. So what this gooey charcoal-like tar does, it coats your cilia of your respiratory tract and paralyzes them. So therefore the chronic smoker's cough, okay? And it also does something similar in pregnant women. If pregnant women have a long history of smoking and continue to smoke, especially during the second trimester of pregnancy, so these same substances, including tar, not only accumulate in their respiratory tract, but they go all the way down into your ovaries and your fallopian tubes. And they also paralyze the cilia and your fallopian tubes. So what does that do? What do the cilia and the fallopian tubes do? These cilia are constantly beating like this, and they are moving the egg from the ovary to the uterus for fertilization, all right? Usually the fertilization of egg by the sperm takes place within the fallopian tube in a region called the ampulla. After fertilization, when you have a zygote, a developing baby, that basically travels down to the uterus and implants itself in the uterine wall, okay? It takes about 7 days post-fertilization. However, if you're a smoker and your cilia are paralyzed, they're not moving much or not at all sometimes. So the egg gets fertilized by the sperm, turns into a zygote, but it's not barely moving through the fallopian tube. So what does it do? It ends up burrowing itself in the epithelial walls of your fallopian tube. And how big is your fallopian tube? It's about the thinness of the human hair. And now you have a baby growing inside of you have a tubal pregnancy, which is a type of ectopic pregnancy, right? This can only go on for as long as 8 weeks max, because at that point, the zygote, the embryo is so big that it's going to pop your ectopic, your fallopian tube. And if that happens, you have peritonitis, surgical emergency. You have to be taken to you cannot salvage this pregnancy anyway. Ectopic pregnancies are non-salvageable. There's no way that you can take an ectopic pregnancy and plant it back in your uterus or something like that. No technique exists to date to do that. So this pregnancy was a non-starter to begin with. Now the mother's life is in jeopardy too, because she's bleeding out of that ruptured fallopian tube, tubal rupture. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So again, falsely stratified. They are single layered, but it seems like they're multi-layered, okay? And they also come in two forms, ciliated and non-ciliated forms. So let's take a look at the ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium first. Again, found in abundance in your respiratory tract. Like your nasal cavity, part of the pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchi. Much of that has this ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, also produces a lot of mucus that is swept up to the back of your throat by means of cilia, where you either spit it out or you swallow it, or whichever way you get rid of it. The non-ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, this is rare. It's not found too commonly, all right? It's mainly for protective purposes, and it's found mainly in the male urethra and epididymis, so in the male genitourinary system. Stratified squamous epithelium, so multiple layers of squamous cells, as you can see here. This is the perfect type of epithelium for protection against friction and abrasion and wear and tear, as you can see here, okay? So the stratified squamous epithelium, again, comes in two forms, keratinized and non-keratinized. So what is keratin? Keratin is this thick, resilient protein which makes up your skin, your hair, your nails, the feathers of birds, the horn of the rhino, the whale teeth, and all those kinds of structures are made up of the same keratin protein, okay? So stratified squamous epithelium could be keratinized with keratin there, or non-keratinized. Both are possible. So let's take a look at the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium first, okay? And so here you have a type of stratified squamous epithelium, no keratin, and this type is usually found in the epidermis of the skin, all right? Epidermis of the skin, the outer layer of the skin. So this one is keratinized, so keratin is present, all right? I hope I said that before. So keratinized stratified squamous epithelium is what you find in your skin, the epidermis of the skin. Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium obviously does not have keratin, okay? And so this is found in other areas where you need wear and tear, friction resistance, such as your oral cavity in the mouth, parts of your throat, larynx, esophagus, even in the vagina and the anus, because those are the areas where you have potential abrasions and friction going on there, right, in the genitourinary area. And so therefore the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, that type is what you find in those areas. All right, next up, stratified cuboidal epithelium. Again, look at the shape, cube shaped and in multiple layers, all right? And so they are mostly found in the ducts or the tubes of most exocrine glands and also ovarian follicles, all right? So the ducts that drain exocrine glands and take away their secretions usually have stratified cuboidal epithelium. So here you have stratified columnar epithelium, right? This one is rare, and like multiple layers of columnar epithelium. And it's usually found in the large ducts of the salivary glands, in the conjunctiva of the eye, the transparent membrane that covers and protects the eye, and the membranous part of the male urethra. Those are the only places where you have stratified columnar epithelium. All right, finally, transitional epithelium, and it's called that because it transitions. It changes its shape from one cell type to another, and it's only found in the urinary tract. All right. And so what happens is, for example, in your urinary bladder, when it's empty, these cells, transitional epithelial cells, are almost columnar shaped, column shaped. But as your urinary bladder fills up with urine, they get compressed, squeezed, and they turn into cuboidal shape, and sometimes even squamous shape if your urine overfills the urinary bladder, right? So transitional epithelium. Look at the difference. This is when you are relaxed, no urine in the urinary bladder, so it's nicely distended, and then it can get compressed when it stretches because of urine. All right, so here we are looking at glands, right? And glands are of two types, exocrine glands and endocrine glands. So what's the difference? Exocrine gland, exo means exit, outwards, right? So exocrine glands secrete their secretions to the outside of the human body, like your sweat glands, your sebaceous glands, salivary glands, right? Tear glands in the eyes. So they all release their secretions to the outside. Endocrine glands are internal. Their secretions are for internal secretion, like insulin or glucagon or thyroid hormones. They do not exit your body. They are secreted inwards. So that's the difference between those two types of glands. So here you're also looking at how can you classify glands by means of their secretions, or all right, based on what types of secretions they have. So for example, among sweat glands, well, you have glands called merocrine glands, as you see here, and they have a watery secretion like what you find in your tears and your saliva, all right? And they secrete by means of exocytosis. Remember, exocytosis is an active process. You burn ATP for exocytosis to throw stuff out of the cell, right? Apocrine glands, these are specialized fat-rich glands found in the axillary region, in the armpits, in the groin region, and around the nipples. And they become active under the influence of sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen at the time of puberty. And that's why this body odor becomes more noticeable at that time in your life, because your apocrine glands become quite active during those days. All right. So that explains it. Uh, and then finally, you have the holocrine glands, as we see here. And they actually, the entire cell ruptures to become the secretion itself. And some examples of holocrine glands are your oil glands or sebaceous glands, sebum, uh, that is secreted on the surface of your skin and has antibacterial properties. So it prevents infection and dehydration of the skin. So here you're looking at the three types: merocrine glands, apocrine glands, holocrine glands. Why does an epithelium need to be highly regenerative? Because it's constantly subject to friction, wear and tear, and you're losing those cells. Why is an epithelium considered selectively permeable? Because certain things can pass across, like oxygen, carbon dioxide, some amounts of water, others cannot, like large proteins. How does simple epithelium differ from stratified epithelium? Simple epithelium has only a single layer of cells. Um, Stratified epithelium has multiple layers, all right? What type of epithelial tissue lines the air sacs of the lungs? So that would be simple squamous epithelium. That is ideal for exchange of gases in that region. All right. What epithelial tissue contains multiple layers of cells? Stratified, right? And the most superficial cells are squamous, dead, and filled with the protein keratin. Oh, keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, such as what makes up the epidermis of your skin. What are the two basic parts of a multicellular exocrine gland? The gland itself and the duct or the tube that attaches to that gland. What are the differences between holocrine and merocrine glands? Merocrine glands are like saliva, tears, and they secrete by means of exocytosis. Holocrine glands, they pinch out their secretions. And some examples of holocrine glands, as you see here, oil glands or sebaceous glands. All right, so here we're looking at some of the characteristics of connective tissue. All right, so we're going to take a look at cells and what is called ground substance here. So the three basic components that all connective tissue have, and we're moving on to connective tissue from epithelial tissue, are cells, protein fibers, and then ground substance. So you have to remember these three components of all connective tissue. All right, so let's start with the cells first. All right, so now cells are the basic structural and functional units of all living things. So in terms of connective tissue cells, they come in two types again: resident cells and wandering cells. So resident cells are called that because they don't wander around. They stick to one surface or one area, and they're localized there. All right, and the major goal, as you can see here, is to support and maintain the extracellular matrix. Okay, some examples of these resident cells: fibroblasts, and the name tells you that they form fibrous tissue, right, like scar tissue. And these are the most abundant resident cells, as you can see here in your connective tissue, okay? Then adipocytes, and adipose is for fat. So these are fat cells, okay? Adipose connective tissue. Mesenchymal cells. Now these are stem cells actually, okay? They're stem cells, which means what are stem cells? Cells that can divide and differentiate to form any tissue in the human body, all right? That's what stem cells are. So mesenchymal cells basically are those. Then also fixed macrophages. Macro means large, phage means to eat, phagy, to eat. So large cell eaters, they're like Pac-Man of the human body, as I mentioned before, right? And they're derived from the white blood cells, as we see here, and their job is to work with the immune system to gobble up and destroy invading foreign particles like viruses and bacteria. So let's move on to wandering cells now, cells that move with your bloodstream or lymph flow to different parts of the body, all right? So white blood cells as an example, also called leukocytes, and they are parts of your immune system, okay? Mast cells, again, are wandering cells, and they are found close to your blood vessels, okay? and they react to these two substances, heparin and histamine. As you can see, heparin causes the inhibition of blood clotting. So you continue to blood. So heparin is used as an anticoagulant. For example, someone with um, an acute heart attack, myocardial infarction, right, because of a clot. So this is a clot buster. Think of it that way. Heparin is used for busting clots because it inhibits blood clotting. Now, histamine, on the other hand, causes dilation of your blood vessels, also makes them leaky, and they also cause your skin to itch. So mast cells, when they rupture, they cause like allergic symptoms, right? So that's basically what mast cells are. They're the allergy-inducing cells of the body. So if you are allergic to, let's say, a wasp sting or something, so that's there because um, you have become sensitized to that, or fire ant sting for that matter. You become sensitized to that venom. As soon as you're stung by those insects, then thousands and thousands of IgE types of antibodies are released, which cause rupture of your mast cells. You secrete a lot of heparin and histamine, and that gives you that inflammation, the welts, the red rash that develops, the itching, the swelling of the tongue, difficulty breathing, all of those things, okay? And then plasma cells are also types of wandering cells. Plasma cells are types of white blood cells that turn into antibodies, okay? Free macrophages versus fixed macrophages. These ones are able to move about. So they're like the patrol unit of the body, right? So they're patrolling the periphery of the body looking for any potentially trouble-causing bacteria or viruses. And then other leukocytes are white blood cells like neutrophils, T lymphocytes. They're all examples of wandering cells too. Okay, so from cells, we have moved on to the protein fibers, okay? So three types that we're looking at here. Collagen fibers. Now these are the toughest, strongest, they're very rope-like fibers. And collagen is found right under your skin. Collagen is what gives your skin its elasticity. So as we get older and the more sun exposure that we get, the more our skin tends to break down, the more the collagen tends to break down, and then it becomes wrinkly and loose, okay? Reticular fibers, the word reticular means like a mesh or a network, like a fish net. So reticular fibers are thinner, kind of like collagen fibers, but not as strong, and they're found in the surrounding capsules of some organs, also called the stroma of those organs, like lymph nodes and spleen. Elastic fibers, the name tells you all, right? They're elastic, so they can stretch and recoil easily. These are found in your skin and the walls of your arteries. Okay, so interesting, the same fibers that make your skin break down and go wrinkly, they are also found in your arteries. So let's say if you see someone who is like all wrinkled in the face, what would you predict? The arteries are pretty much messed up as well? Well, fortunately, not quite, okay? So let's take some quick notes here. Let's call it wrinkled skin and arterial condition. Okay. So fortunately, in this case, as I was saying, the state of your skin, the wrinkled state of your skin does not reflect necessarily on the integrity of your blood vessels, okay? And why is that? Because your skin is constantly exposed to sunlight, the sun's harmful ultraviolet type B radiation, but the sunlight does not penetrate into your blood vessels, right? So your skin tends to break down, but your blood vessels does not necessarily follow the same pattern, okay? However, if you're smoking and eating unhealthy stuff, taking drugs, not exercising, then your arteries are going to be just as bad, and the collagen breakdown would be just as great as on your skin on the outside. So then you have finally ground substance. Ground substance is non-cellular material, which is produced by your connective tissue cells, right? And it's kind of like a jelly-like substance, all right, in places like cartilage, okay? It could be viscous, like in blood, or it could be solid, for example, in bone. So ground substance could be in different forms depending on where in the body it's found, okay? All right, so when you take ground substance and the protein fibers together, that is what extracellular matrix is, the protein fibers plus the ground substance. And here are some examples of ground substances like glycosaminoglycans, okay, proteoglycans and glycoproteins. They're usually found in your joints. And so if you have like joint pain or arthritis, if you walk into these pharmacies, sometimes you'll see many joint supplements like osteobiflex. That is a famous one, right? And if you take a look at their ingredients, you will see things like chondroitin sulfate, right? chondroitin sulfate, and hyaluronic acid. So in other words, a lot of ground substance. So the thinking is if you have ingest those ground substances, right, they will somehow get to your joints and accumulate there and make your joints supple and friction free. Unfortunately, uh, no such thing happens. Why? Because you take those pills orally, and those ground substances get destroyed and broken down in your stomach, and they never make their way out in the form that you would hope them to your uh, to your joints. So those osteobiflex, those supplements they have no benefit in preventing osteoporosis or osteoarthritis or any of those conditions. In fact, none of those supplements have been proven to show any benefit. The only possible exception, fish liver oil, okay? So if you take fish liver oil or fish oil supplements, they have shown some benefit in reducing your triglycerides and your cardiac risk, okay? Other than that, it's basically all unverified claims, all right? FDA does not evaluate those claims. All right, so here you're looking at your connective tissue, okay? So cells, these look like fat cells, adipocytes, collagen fibers, these tough, thick, rope-like fibers. Here's connective tissue with blood vessels, right? Uh, then you have the wandering cells, a bunch of white blood cells that are moving about. You can see those too. Here's the extracellular matrix made up of the ground substance and the three different types of protein fibers, elastic fiber, collagen fibers, and then the reticular fibers. So you can see all cells, uh, protein fibers, and ground substance, all of them. So another clinical picture that we are looking at here is something called scurvy. And scurvy is caused by deficiency of vitamin C. Vitamin C is found in citrus fruits, pineapples, oranges, lemons, lime, right? Uh, Mangoes, tropical fruits, basically the orange and the yellow ones. And so, a lack of vitamin C in a diet can lead to scurvy. And what vitamin C does is it's an important component of collagen formation, okay? So when it's lacking in your diet, then you get these kinds of things, problems with wound healing, the skin is unhealthy, it tends to bleed and infect easily, bone growth is abnormal, all those kinds of things, all right? And all that can be reversed by taking vitamin C supplements or just eating citrus fruits. So these are some of the functions of your connective tissue: physical protection, right? Like the uh, hypodermis of the skin, support and structural framework like stroma surrounding your organs, binding of structures like tendons and ligaments and cartilage, they bind structures together, storage like fat store energy, transport like white blood cells and red blood cells in your blood take, and blood is a type of connective tissue, remember, from place to place. Immune protection, those would be your white blood cells again, uh, and your antibodies. So some types of embryonic connective tissue, mesenchyme, right? So mesenchyme, again, as I mentioned, are those types of stem cells that can turn into any other human cell type. And then something called mucous connective tissue. And this is found in the umbilical cord only. Uh, so there was this controversy earlier that if you were trying to gain access to embryonic stem cells, sometimes the embryos were destroyed, right? So it was an ethical dilemma. However, you can get uh, some embryonic stem cells from the mother's umbilical cord as well, all right? So that's an important source of, so umbilical cord is important because it's a ready supply of stem cells, okay? So Marfan syndrome is another genetic disorder that you inherit. And what happens here is you have problems with your joints being hyperlax or hyperflexible or hyperextensible, right? So these people are usually very tall in height and they have very loose, floppy wings, kind of like a Gumby-like picture, that cartoon character or the animation, right? Because they're weak ligaments and tendons, unfortunately, and they're also weak lens of the eye, so they have problems with vision as well. And unfortunately, they also have weaknesses in their blood vessels, including the aorta, which is your chief blood vessel. So they tend to uh, have a much shorter lifespan because of all of those complications as related to other people. So one famous case who suffered from that was an African-American female athlete by the name of Flo Hyman, and she was a very gifted volleyball player back in the early 80s. She was getting ready for her Olympics competitions. Unfortunately, she collapsed during some of the pre-Olympic games, qualifying games, and when they got to her on the court, she had already passed away. And so when they did an autopsy on her, they found that she had a burst aorta. She had an aneurysm in the aorta and that had burst open. And she was unusually tall. She was already 6 feet 6 inches or 7 inches at that point. So she had a magnificent like reach, perfect attribute to look for in a volleyball player, but unfortunately it also became her shortcoming. Okay. All right, so then different types of connective tissue is what we are looking at here. So let's start with what is called loose connective tissue. And why is it called loose? Because it has less cells and more ground substance, fewer cells, okay? 3 types of loose connective tissue, like areolar, adipose, and reticular, as you see here. So the areolar connective tissue is very vascular, a lot of blood supply there. It's made up of loose collagen and elastic fibers together, okay? Lots of ground substance, it's viscous. It's found in places like here, in the layers of your dermis, just under the skin, nerve and muscle cells, and some blood vessels as well. Adipose connective tissue is fat cells, basically, right? Fat cells are of 2 types, white fat and brown fat. Brown fat is found in infants. You were born with a lot of brown fat because since their hypothalamus, their body's own thermostat is not mature enough to work at that point. So nature has equipped them with this type of fat, brown fat that regulates the body temperature, prevents heat loss. But as we get older, all of that brown fat becomes replaced by white fat. And white fat is energy rich, but if you have a lot of visceral belly fat, then that is a risk factor for many different diseases like cancers, heart disease, strokes, sleep apnea, metabolic syndrome, high blood pressure, so on and so forth, long list, okay? Reticular connective tissue is next in loose connective tissue. So these, if you look at the picture, there's meshwork-like appearance, right? Fat cells are easy to recognize. They're these like globules, white globules, or these yellow fat-filled cells. Those are adipocytes, okay? Areolar connective tissue, you see collagen and elastin fibers all across here. All right, so the reticular connective tissue, again, as we mentioned before, is found in the capsule or the stroma surrounding many of the organs, like your immune organs or lymphatic organs, as you see here, spleen, lymph nodes, etc. Okay, so then connective tissue, now we're talking about dense connective tissue from loose connective tissue. So 3 types of loose connective tissue were there: areolar, adipose, and reticular. So dense connective tissue has, again, 3 types: dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Why is it called dense? Because there are more cells packed in here, more cells, okay? So dense regular connective tissue looks like it has this wavy appearance, very organized in one direction, right? They almost look like waves. In the places where you have this type of dense regular connective tissue would be your cartilage, your tendons, and your ligaments. So cartilage is a connective tissue that protects your joints. Ligaments connect bone to bone, and tendons connect skeletal muscle to bone. That's what they do, all right? And this type of dense regular connective tissue is avascular. There's not a good blood supply. It's very nerve-rich, richly innervated, so it's very sensitive, but it's not rich in blood supply. And that's why they say it's better to break your bone than to get a sprain, right? Because sprains are basically tears in your ligaments, and they take forever to heal because they're non-vascular. Fractures happen in bones, and bones are some of the most vascular organs in the human body. So no such thing as dry as a bone. They are in fact very wet. So something to remember. And then, so sprains versus fractures. All right. So then dense irregular connective tissue. Now, if you look at this picture under the microscope, you see it does not have that wavy, organized pattern. It's like kind of all over the place, right? So irregular. That's why clumps of collagen fibers in all different directions. And so this is for resistance and support in many different directions, such as your skin. When your skin is like pinched in different directions, the dense irregular connective tissue gives it resilience, as does the surrounding membrane of the bone, the periosteum, and the perichondrium surrounding the cartilage as well. Elastic connective tissue, the name says it all. It's elastic, found in places like your large arteries. Again, people with Marfan syndrome, like Flo Hyman, unfortunately, have gaps and vulnerabilities there because the arteries are weak. Vocal cords in your windpipe, some other places where you have elastic tissue. All right, so let's talk about these types of supporting connective tissue, cartilage and bone. So what is cartilage first? It's semi-solid, uh, extracellular matrix, protein fibers and ground substance that make it up. There's collagen and elastin fibers. The cells that make cartilage are called chondrocytes. Chondro means cartilage, all right, surrounded by a membrane called perichondrium. So cartilage again comes in three types, as you see here: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Cartilage again is for protection of the joints, as we mentioned before. Let's take a look at the first type, hyaline cartilage. So it has this what is called an alzai appearance. So you see these double cells, doubles, diploids together, right? So very characteristic appearance that will help you identify hyaline cartilage. Where is it found? It's found in places like your voice box, your trachea, windpipe, your nose, also the ends of your long bones. In fact, when you are growing taller, it's not that your bones are stretching or getting longer, it's actually the hyaline cartilage at the ends of your bones that is getting thicker, and it's making you basically grow taller, all right? And when you were a fetus in your mother's womb, your skeleton was not ossified, it was not bones at that point, it was all hyaline cartilage. So by about 7 weeks of pregnancy is when the fetus gets completely ossified, the bones, not completely, but much more ossified, right? You still have a soft spot on the skull, which has not ossified even at the time of birth. Okay, so the next step after hyaline cartilage is the most common type in the human body. 90% of the cartilage in the human body is fibrocartilage, hyaline cartilage, okay? And again, it looks like those double owlies, if you will, under the microscope, all right? So next up, we have fibrocartilage, and as the name itself tells you, there's a lot of fibrous tissue here as well. This is pretty tough, okay? Weight-bearing cartilage. It's not as flexible as hyaline cartilage, okay? It's tough, it's resilient, the fibrocartilage. And so where is it found? In these three places, in between your discs in the back, intervertebral discs. So for example, if you lift heavy weights and you get the lower back pain because of that, something called sciatica, it could be because one of those discs have slipped because of weightlifting, right? Those discs, they function to prevent your vertebrae from like grinding against each other. But if they slip, something called disc hernia, the disc herniates, moves away from in between your vertebrae, then that causes pain because the sensory nerves are being pinched in your spinal canal at that point. Also your pubic symphysis. Pubic symphysis is your pelvic joint, right in front of your pelvis. That joint is also made up of fibrocartilage. In females during pregnancy, under the influence of progesterone, which is the female hormone, the pubic symphysis becomes quite dilated and relaxed. For childbirth, so when the baby is born, the pubic symphysis literally moves considerably. In males, no such thing happens. And also in your knee joint, in the menisci of the knee joint is where you will find fibrocartilage. And this is how fibrocartilage looks like under the microscope. There's no double cells, just a single cell, as you see here. Okay, next up is elastic cartilage, and it's elastic. Okay, you can stretch it and then it recoils back, as you can see here. It's found in your external ear. You can see that this is elastic, and your epiglottis, which is this flap-like tissue that closes down on your trachea when you swallow, so your food does not go down your windpipe, okay? All right, next up we have bone. Bone is definitely more solid than cartilage, right? So the ground substance is very solid, less flexible. The bone has two parts, an organic part called the osteoid and an inorganic part, which is made up of salts like calcium and phosphorus, okay? So the organic or the living components of bone are made up of proteins like collagen and glycoproteins, okay? Just like cartilage. The inorganic component is what makes the bone thick and stiff and hard, okay? The calcium salts, the calcium phosphate salts, they confer this rigidity to the bones, all right? So two types of bones, compact versus spongy bone. And these are not like located in two different parts of the body. These two types of bone are found within the same structure. So the compact bone is the hard outer shell of a bone, all right? And how you would recognize that you're looking at compact bone is, when you look at it under the microscope, is you will see this specific appearance like this. Again, owl's eye, right? But these are large, rather large. The whole thing is called an osteon. That's a central canal in between the osteon, right? So you see, when you see these osteons, you know you're looking at compact bone, okay? 80% of your bone is like that. The spongy bone is the rest of the 20%, and this is like spongy, literally. So it's like if you've ever eaten like a chicken leg, like a drumstick, and if you strip away the outer bone, then you get to the spongy part where you might find bone marrow and even sometimes blood if it's improperly cooked. So the spongy bone forms the insides of the bone, as you can see here. The functions of bones are many. They protect vital organs. They give you support. They're the attachment point for muscles. They also make blood, interestingly. Our hematopoietic blood forming organ is actually bone. So no such thing as dry as a bone, right? They're very wet. So this is what compact bone would look like under the microscope. So you see the osteon, a central canal here for arteries and veins and nerves to pass in and out of the bone. Okay, so now we are looking at a fluid type of connective tissue, which is blood itself. Remember, blood is also a tissue and a connective tissue at that. And the blood is made up of blood cells like white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets, which are broken down bits and pieces of cells, all right? And a liquid part, which is called plasma. And plasma has like, it's mostly water, but also dissolved proteins and salts and hormones and wastes. All those things are also found there. 45% of the blood is about that much is your cellular elements or cells. The rest of the 55% is made up of the watery plasma, as you can see, okay? And then you also have lymph. Lymph is a type of fluid connective tissue as well. And it is, again, derived from the blood plasma. It's not red in color because the hemoglobin and the red blood cells stay behind, okay? And the lymph carries fats and immune cells, lots of white blood cells. So this is what your blood smear would look like on the microscope. These are all erythrocytes, red blood cells that carry oxygen. That is a neutrophil, one of the white blood cells, and that's a monocyte, okay? Actually, that's a lymphocyte. So those two are white blood cells. So what are the basic functional differences between resident cells and wandering cells? Wandering cells wander. They're the patrol units of the body. Resident cells are attached, fixed to one place. What is the function of glycosaminoglycans and ground substance? To give viscosity and friction proofing to the joints. What are some of the general functions of connective tissue? It connects the different body parts together. What is the composition of mesenchyme? Stem cells. And what is its function? Stem cells can differentiate into any other type of body cell if and when needed, okay? All right, then. So the next step, what we have is muscle tissue. And again, remember the four types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. So the muscle tissue itself is made up of these three subtypes, as you can see here: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And even though you have these three different classes, the underlying action and mechanism of function is the same, okay? So muscles are about contraction, okay? So if there's one thing that basically typifies a muscle tissue is contraction and relaxation in different ways, though. So as we shall see, the skeletal muscle is a little bit different in terms of contractility and other aspects as compared to cardiac and then smooth muscle there. So going on with those different types here, skeletal muscle tissue is also referred to as voluntary muscle or also striated muscle. Striation means stripes, okay? And that is because when you look at skeletal muscle under the microscope, you see this striped appearance because you have alternating bands of thick protein called myosin and thin protein called actin, okay? And so this alternating band pattern gives it the striated appearance. And the function of skeletal muscle is, of course, is to move your skeleton, right? So these skeletal muscles are attached to bones, and the bones, they contract to move the bones, and therefore the entire movement of the organism is what you're looking at here. They're voluntary, so you actually can control when and where to move that muscle. So this is what your skeletal muscle looks like under the microscope. As you can see here, you can see the striations, those stripes, so alternating bands of dark and light protein fibers, as you can see, You also see multiple nuclei here, all right, striations in the nuclei. Okay, cardiac muscle is next, and the outstanding feature here of the cardiac muscle is it is basically inexhaustible for the most part, right? So it does not tire easily. And that is the reason why the heart is an organ that keeps pumping blood from the time that it is formed, about 4 weeks of development till the end of your life, right? So cardiac muscle is not easily fatigable. It keeps working. And that has to do with the way it's arranged, which we shall look at later on, all right? It also has striations like the skeletal muscle, okay? And the one feature that distinguishes cardiac muscle from both skeletal and smooth muscle is they have something called the intercalated discs, okay? So what are the intercalated discs? These are made up of gap junctions. So why does the cardiac muscle have gap junctions? Because those gap junctions allow for ions, sodium and potassium in particular, and calcium too, to move across the entire body of the heart muscle, and therefore the entire organ acts as a sensation. And as you shall see, a sensation is a group of tissues that work in synchrony all together. And it's most important for the heart. As we know, we don't want our heart to go haywire because that would result in things like atrial or ventricular fibrillation and then cardiac arrest, right? Okay, it's also involuntary. So it generates its own rhythm by an area called the SA, or the sinoatrial node. This is what the cardiac muscle looks like under the microscope. So there you're looking at the intercalated discs, if you see here. And these are made up of gap junctions, as I said before. So these are intercalated discs uh, meant for, which are gap junctions meant for the transmission of electrical impulses in a timely fashion all across the organ. So it acts, it contracts together as a synchronous organ, as you can see here. All right, so something to remember. Smooth muscles are unstriated or non-striated, so they do not have that striated pattern, even though they're made up of the same two fibers, the actin and the myosin, but they're arranged in a way where you do not have this striated appearance. Each individual cell is like leaf shaped, also called a fusiform shape, as we shall see, or a spindle shape. Your smooth muscle is again involuntary, not in your conscious control, like the cardiac muscle. And it's found in your internal viscera, the organs like your digestive organs, respiratory organs, genitourinary tract, and those kinds of places. So here, you're looking at an individual smooth cell, a smooth muscle cell. You can see the fusiform or the spindle or the leaf shape, right? You see the absence of striations. None of those are seen here. So very specific appearance, as you can see. Compare and contrast the structure of skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue. One is, well, they're both striated. Cardiac muscle has intercalated discs. Skeletal muscle has no such structure, okay? All right, last up, we have the nervous tissue. And one feature that distinguishes nervous tissue from all other is excitability to electrical impulses. So your nervous tissue is kind of like an electricity grid, an electrical grid. If you look outside at those power uh, generating towers, right, and the electrical lines, that's pretty much what your nervous system is, all the way from your brain and spinal cord, which is your central nervous system, all the way out to your peripheral nervous system, okay? And so each uh, part of this nervous tissue is made up of cells called neurons. Neurons are specialized cells specifically meant for electrical conduction, okay? And then you also have an even larger number of glial cells, which is a mind-boggling thought, because how many neurons do you have? So approximately we have as many neurons in our brain as there are stars in all the galaxies in the universe, all right? And so what is that number then? Let's get a fair idea here. So in our very own Milky Way galaxy, there are approximately 100 billion stars, okay? So just think of that number. Not thousands, not million, not even a billion, not even 10 billion, 100 billion stars in our Milky Way galaxy alone. But that's not nearly uh, close to the magnitude of the universe. So that's just Milky Way galaxy, right? 100 billion stars. So the question is, how many galaxies are there in the universe? So according to a conservative estimate, at least 100 billion galaxies, okay? So if you were to try to work out the number of stars in the universe, you have to multiply at least 100 billion by 100 billion, likely more. So what number is that? 100 billion times 100 billion. So that almost reaches infinity. So that's the number of connections that your neurons have. It's a mind-boggling thought. The amount of biological sophistication that you have right up here is mind-boggling right there, okay? And if you work in the neurology ward or look at neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, it's really like it's an otherworldly science, right? It's almost mystical, as you can see. So you have to become a believer of some sort in some sort of biological force or whatever you want to call it, right? Just based on that. So uh, and even a larger number of glial cells. So glial cells literally means glue-like cells because they stick the neurons together. Glial cells are insulators. In other words, they do not conduct electricity. Their sole function is to support and nourish and remove wastes from the neurons. All right. So glial cells also called neuroglia. And interestingly, so possibly the most famous brain in the world, right? Arguably of all time, Albert Einstein. So people were fascinated with his brain. This guy, this seemingly pudgy, middle-aged guy who would just sit in his armchair and just close his eyes and work out the workings of the universe in his own brain without ever having traveled to like outer space or anywhere or not having uh, uh, the facility of traveling at the speed of light or anything, but he came up with E equals MC square and all those kinds of discoveries. How did he do that? So people were intrigued and are still intrigued with his brain. So fortunately, in this interest of science, he actually uh, donated his brain for medical research in his will after his death. And so that's what they did promptly. They removed his brain after his death. They made many slices, sections of it, and they sent it to different universities and scholarly medical institutions all across the world for study. So the scientists studied his brain tissue uh, very intensively and almost obsessively, right? And so the common thought was, well, maybe he has more neurons than an average individual or something like that. But when they looked at the brain tissue, they found no such difference, same number of average neurons, right? However, they did notice something unusual about the brain. And that was uh, two things. One, his number of glial cells, the cells that support the neurons, seem to be much thicker, almost twice as thick as a normal person, as an average person, right? So there's glial cells. So his neurons were hypercharged and hypernourished and were able to withstand injury much more because of a genetic mutation. Just he was a genetic freak, if you will. And also his corpus callosum, which is a tissue of the brain that connects the two hemispheres, the right and the left hemisphere of the brain together, was twice as thick. Women in general have thicker corpus callosum. Their two brains work more in synchrony with each other as compared to an average male. But for Albert Einstein, that was much thicker. So that was basically indicative of the fact that the two parts of his brain were able to communicate and talk to each other much more efficiently and make sense of things much faster than the average person. So some fascinating insight that came out of that study. All right, so here you're looking at a typical neuron, right? In a very peculiar shape, as you can see, almost looks like a shrimp or some an alien creature from outer space. So what we see here is this cell body, all right? And you see a nucleus in there as well. What you have inside of here is something called the exoplasm, cytoplasm found within the neuron. These hair-like structures are called dendrites, and they bring in electrical information to the cell body. The cell body shoots down this information through this tail-like process called the axon to these little tiny knobs at the end called the axon terminals. These axon terminals then release neurotransmitters, these chemicals which bind to the dendrites of the next adjoining neuron. The whole cycle repeats again, and so then neurotransmitters are secreted here, and it's carried on to the dendrites of the next neuron. So it's a whole chain of communication in this electric grid that we know as our nervous system, as you can see here. So here are your neurons under a microscope, an actual image that you can see here too. You see the cell body, you see the nucleus, you see the dendrites, here's the axon. All of those are visible. Difference between a neuron and a glial cell: neurons can generate and conduct electricity. Glial cells simply support them. So what are organs then? Organs are bunches of tissues working together to accomplish a common function. As an example, your stomach. And your stomach is a perfect example of an organ because you see all different tissue types working in concert here. How's that? Here's the epithelial tissue. What type of epithelium do you see? Do you think it is? It's a simple columnar epithelium. You can see the column-like cells, right? Then there's a connective tissue here. That's your basement membrane and the connective tissue full of blood vessels, uh, collagen, elastic fibers, right? And fat cells, all of that. Then here's your smooth muscle of the stomach. So that's muscle tissue. And throughout, you see sensory nerves um, innervating the whole structure. So that's your nervous tissue. All four types of tissues are found within the stomach, therefore making it an organ. So then body membranes, we have these four types: mucous membranes in your nose, in your intestines, GI tract, in your genitourinary tract too. Mucus is basically a protective secretion that traps and kills bacteria and fungi and other parasites, right? So mucus is a protective uh, secretion. Your best protection against things like the coronavirus or common cold viruses or anything, nothing else but this good old biological secretion in your nose. So as unsightly as your mucus might be, uh, it has a very important function, right? And so one more reason to love your mucus. Okay, serous membranes are next. And serous membranes secrete a serous secretion, which is like watery fluid. And examples are like your peritoneal fluid, your pleural fluid, pericardial fluid, all of those. They prevent friction when your organs distend and contract, and also removes waste and provides nourishment. Cutaneous membrane, that's your skin. Cutaneous means skin, so skin membrane here. And then synovial membrane is what is found in your joints, in your synovial joint. So any joint that you can crack, basically, like your fingers, like your neck knuckles, that cracking sound is because of when you move your joint, suddenly it releases a lot of dissolved gases, gaseous pressures, carbon dioxide particularly. And so those bubbles actually pop, and it's that popping sound that you hear. It's not your bones making that sound. And no, cracking your knuckles does not cause arthritis, all right? So some things to keep in mind. That's a myth. So let's take notes. Okay, ran out of ink on this one. Cracking your knuckles and synovial fluid. So it's the exact same phenomenon as popping open your champagne bottle, right? So when you remove the cork from there, the popping sound, it's because of the dissolved carbon dioxide bubbles basically being released. Okay, so yes, we talked about those types of why the stomach is considered an organ. All of those different tissue types work together. Differences between parietal and visceral layer is the same membrane. It doubles up over itself, as you remember from our earlier discussion, right? The outer layer is called the parietal layer of the membrane. The inner one is called the visceral layer, which is right next to the organ itself. Okay, so finally, we are looking at the development of these different tissues, okay? And this happens at a very early stage, at the embryonic stage. So by your third week of development in your mother's womb, you have developed these three primary germ layers called ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderms. What does this word germ mean anyway? Germ is anything that grows and multiplies. That's what a germ is. It comes from the word germination. To germinate means to like grow and develop, right? That's germ. So germs that multiply very fast. So germ layers will multiply to form your adult body organs. So in an embryo, though, you only have three layers of primary germ layers. Those are ectoderm, ecto means outside layer, mesoderm, meso means middle, and endoderm, which means the innermost layer, okay? So what forms from each of those? And in this picture tells you what? The ectoderm in your embryonic stage will eventually develop into ecto means outside layer. It will form the outside layers of your body. So what are those? Of course, your skin. It comes out of the ectoderm, your brain and spinal cord, your central nervous system, also your sweat glands, sebaceous glands, hair follicles, the lens of the eye, the enamel of the teeth, the adrenal medulla. These are some other organs that arise out of the ectoderm. Then in the middle, ectoderm is in blue, as you can see, the outermost layer when you were an embryo. Then in the middle is the mesoderm, the middle layer, and the middle layer forms the middle structure. So what lies just underneath your skin? Um, Fat, collagen, connective tissue, blood, right? Bones, muscle, all of that comes from or derives from the mesoderm. And then finally, the endoderm. Endo means innermost, right? And the endoderm, the innermost germ layer, basically forms the lining of your internal organs, especially your digestive organs. So now you remember what those three germ layers give rise to. Ecto, outside organs and structures, mesoderm, the middle ones, and endoderm for the inner ones. All right, so some other uh, terms that we see here that apply to tissues. Hypertrophy. Simple example, you start eating a lot of protein, you start lifting weights, and your muscles get larger. Why? Because your individual muscle fibers, skeletal muscle fibers, get thicker and bigger. That's hypertrophy, okay? No increase in the number of fibers, but only in the individual size and strength. That's hypertrophy. Hyperplasia is a different type of growth, which a perfect example of which would be when you get pregnant. So your uterus, which is about the size of a pear, it's a pear-shaped and pear-sized organ, but it can grow to like humongous sizes, right? You can carry triplets, quadruplets, even more. It can get quite big. So how does the uterus get big? By not only hypertrophy, but actually increasing the number of smooth muscle cells found there. So as a general rule, skeletal muscle only shows hypertrophy, no hyperplasia, okay? Smooth muscle shows hyperplasia as well. It can actually increase the number of muscle fibers or muscle cells present uh, in the parent muscle. So that's what you see here in hyperplasia. Atrophy is the exact opposite. So when you stop lifting weights or you become bedridden because of some chronic disease or something, then your muscles basically just shrivel up and they break down. Something called catabolic state or catabolism. We mentioned that earlier during our lectures, right? So atrophy is a loss of muscle or body mass because of that. So stem cells, all right, stem cells are those cells, early primordial undifferentiated cells in embryo, in a human embryo, that can divide to form any of the mature organs that you can see here, right? So for example, you have what are called totipotent cells. They have the potential, potent, to totally potent, totipotent. They have this potential to form um, every differentiated cell in the organism. The most valuable are these. Then you have the pluripotent cells. They have the potential to develop into plural, multiple tissues, not as many as totipotent, but still in many different tissues. Then and those two are found in the embryos in large numbers. By the time you become an adult, as you see here, uh, then those cells become multipotent, which means they are capable of differentiating into other tissues, but a limited ability at this point. And unipotent stem cells, they only make one type of tissue. And that's why you basically would prefer to get your stem cells from embryos, because they have so much more potential, right? Okay, so then you have something called metaplasia. Meta means across. What is metaplasia? When one type of epithelium changes into another type because of some chronic injury. I'll give you an example. In chronic smokers, for example, right? So what happens in chronic smokers? Uh, so what is the normal type of epithelium that makes up the trachea, lines the trachea and the respiratory passages in a person? Uh, Ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. We mentioned it, right? If someone who smokes or vapes repeatedly because of constant smoking injury, this type of epithelium, the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, actually changes into stratified squamous epithelium. Why? Because stratified squamous epithelium is better suited to withstand this injury from the smoke. So metaplasia is a change of one type of epithelium into another type to withstand injury. Another example, if you have chronic heartburn or GERD, which stands for uh, gastroesophageal reflux disease, chronic heartburn, more common in people who are like obese or overweight, physically inactive, eat late at night and sleep flat on their backs. It's quite common there, right? So and what causes it is this constant backwash of your stomach acid into your esophagus. Your esophagus or gullet or food tube has stratified squamous epithelium for protection. Your stomach, on the other hand, has simple columnar epithelium. But if your stomach acid is constantly washing back up into your esophagus, then it transplants those columnar cells into the lower end or the distal end of your esophagus. So instead of stratified squamous epithelium there, it turns into the stomach-like columnar epithelium. So that is metaplasia. And metaplasia is your first sign, warning sign that things are not as they should be. All is not well. You need to quit smoking, or you need to take care of your heartburn, GERD, whatever. Because if you uh, continue ignoring this change of tissue type, which will only be detected by a pathologist under the microscope, then you can develop dysplasia. Dysplasia is basically mutated cells. When the cells, their DNA is kind of going all haywire, the cells are assuming abnormal shape and abnormal activity. And this is something that you might catch on a pap smear, right? So a pap smear, again, is done um, preferably on all reproductive age women, right? Um, and it's done on the cervix, where a doctor will scrape your cervical tissue with the coldoscope and take a look at it under the microscope after coloring the cells, right? And so if you see mutated cells there, no, that's a danger sign. Something is chronically irritating the cervix that's causing those cells to mutate. It could be unprotected sex with multiple partners who are infected with the HPV virus, which stands for human papilloma virus, okay? And these two strains of human papilloma virus, strain 16 and 18, are especially implicated in causing dysplasia in the cervix, all right? If you continue ignoring dysplasia as well, then you end up finally with neoplasia. Neo means new, plasia means growth, a new growth. You're talking about a tumor, a cancer. So now here, tissue growth is out of control, neoplastic, neoplasia, which means from metaplasia, it went on to dysplasia, and now neoplasia, where it has become a tumor. But if you're lucky, then the tumor is benign, which means it's not a cancer. It's localized to one place and it's not sending seedlings to all of the different parts of the body to spread, right? But if it's malignant, that means it's metastasizing. It's sending out its little baby seedlings all over your body, and it's gonna basically seed you all over. All right. So that is cancer, actually. Necrosis means cell death, such as when you get some injury like a frostbite because of extreme temperature, or you burn your skin and you know how scar tissue develops and the skin peels away. That's necrosis. It can happen to your tissues too. Your tissues can die as well because of lack of blood supply, like your appendix. If you have acute appendicitis, uh, and it ruptures, right? Tissue death. So gangrene is another example. Gangrene is when your tissues die because of lack of blood supply. It's commonly seen in diabetics because diabetics have vasculopathy. Their blood is not circulating properly to all the tissues. So because of lack of blood supply, lack of ischemia, the tissues die off. Gangrene usually happens in the foot. So foot ulcers are quite common in diabetics because, again, no blood supply there, and they don't even have functional nerves, so they don't feel the pain of what's happening there. So this foot ulcer can really cause gangrene, and then you have to cut out, you have to amputate the limb there. So right, so necrosis is, or gangrene is most common in your limbs, fingers, toes, because these are the parts which are exposed to the elements, right? So frostbite or lack of blood supply, that all happens in your fingers and your toes, right? Such as people with Raynaud's phenomenon. And my wife is one sufferer of such a phenomenon, Raynaud's phenomenon, mostly found in females, right? And what happens here is when you're exposed to cold temperatures, you get these pins and needles, painful sensations in your fingers and toes, and they turn like purple, right? And so that's a vascular issue, right? Usually it's not dangerous, but you're more likely to develop gangrene and frostbite if exposed to extreme temperatures, right? The treatment is no harder than just simply immersing your extremities in lukewarm water, all right? But much more serious is something like this, intestinal gangrene. If your intestine gets obstructed because of some tumor or a foreign object that you might have swallowed, because of a hernia, which is hernias like when your internal organs kind of protrude out and they get like stuck in your peritoneal membrane, cutting out the blood supply, that can cause your intestines to burst. And that's peritonitis that will lead to death and infection. So different types of gangrene, dry gangrene. This is what happens when you, for example, something called an ice mummy, right? So these dead bodies, which are left out in very cold temperatures, they don't really uh, decompose because it's so cold that bacteria even don't work at those temperatures. And they become dehydrated though, which is called desiccation, right? They become desiccated and shriveled due to extreme cold. So that's called dry gangrene. But if the temperature is more tropical, hot, warm, and humid, then wet gangrene is what you see, where you see these greenish fluids oozing out of a gangrenous uh, body part, right? Because of bacterial infection, because bacteria thrive at tropical humid temperatures, right? After death, also you see this greenish fluid basically oozing out. That's wet gangrene. Um, so that will also, if you're a forensic pathologist, uh, that will give you some good indication as to what were the conditions around when the person died, right? Uh, and dry versus wet gangrene. So that's an indicator of the surrounding temperature of the body, whether it was tropical hot conditions, fast decomposition, wet gangrene, or ice mummy formation, dry gangrene. Finally, you have something called gas gangrene, and here you get blisters. It also happens after death, and it's usually because of infection with a bacterium called Clostridium uh, perfringens. Clostridium perfringens, okay? And so this bacterium is notorious for causing gas gangrene, where these blisters fill up with gas and they pop, releasing, oozing fluid out, and also gas bubbles are produced there. So what happens to your tissues as you age? The blood supply goes down, so infections, lack of blood supply, right? Your skin becomes wrinkled and brittle, bones become brittle, you are more likely to develop infections and fractures, right? Your muscles atrophy too because you don't have as much testosterone or growth hormone as you did when you were younger. You become more vulnerable to dehydration and infections. Two things: dehydration and infection are the most uh, concerning conditions in the elderly, in the geriatric population. What are the three primary germ layers and when do they form? Ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, they form between 4 to 8 weeks of development in the embryo. What is the difference between metaplasia, dysplasia, and a malignant neoplasia? Metaplasia, one type of epithelium changes into a different type to withstand injury. Dysplasia, when mutated cells start appearing. Malignant neoplasia is cancer, which is metastasizing or spreading to different parts of the body. How do epithelial and connective tissue change when we age? They become thin and less blood supplied and less sensitive and less well functioning. Dehydration and infections are the two major threats at this point. All right, so here we are done with chapter 5. So hopefully you'll find time to turn in your lecture exam. I will be putting those grades in by tomorrow. Keep working on your lab assignments that I've sent out. I will be sending out I have sent out your lab practical #1 study guide too, which is on Monday. And I will be sending out uh, guidelines for your case studies as well. Uh, so keep up the good work and let me know if you have any questions, concerns, feedback, suggestions. And I'll see you all tomorrow virtually, sometime in the evening. So take care then. Bye-bye.